Hey guys, today we're going to do Chapter 1, Section 5, which is on histograms. So you might initially look at a histogram and say, oh, that's just a bar graph. Well, bar graphs and histograms are just a little bit different, and the way that they're different is that histograms always talk about intervals, whereas bar graphs talk about categories. Alright, so our frequency histogram displays the number of values that fall into each non-overlapping interval of equal width, and our relative frequency histogram displays the percent of values that fall into each interval. So you'll notice that our frequency histogram and our relative frequency histogram look pretty much the exact same. The only difference is the way that our y-axis is labeled. So what's the difference between a frequency histogram and a relative frequency histogram? Well, one displays the frequency of values while the other displays percentages. So the frequency histogram displays frequencies, while our relative frequency histogram displays percentages. Okay, so to make a histogram, the first thing you do is you need to set the intervals. Usually you want between 5 and 10 different intervals, so you want to make sure that you're setting, between 6 and 10 different intervals. So you want to make sure that you're making them big enough or small enough to where you can get about 6 to 10 intervals. Okay, and then you want to count the number of observations per interval and then draw the graph. So we're going to make a histogram for our chart on page 29. So that was our basically yearly student charges for room, board, and tuition in public colleges by state. So we've got our 50 states here, starting with Oklahoma and ending with Vermont. And we want to calculate how much is going to go within each interval. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what are our intervals. So looking at this chart, my minimum is 4,205 and my maximum is 10,401. So my intervals, I'm just going to say go by the thousands. So I'm going to start with between 4,000 and 4,999. Then I'm going to go 5,000 to 5,999, all the way up to 10,000 to 10,999. And that should be enough intervals for my graph. Okay? So if I'm going to make that frequency histogram, I'm going to make this make 4,000 to 4,999. Okay, this next one will be 5,000 to 5,999, 6,000. Okay, so now I've got my intervals up here. Next thing I'm going to do is count the number of observations per interval. So between 4,000 and 4,999, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 observations. So I'm going to graph that on my chart here. And I'm just going to label it as being 4 so that I know. Okay, next up, if I count between 5,000 and 5,999, I get 20. Okay, between 6,000 and 6,999, I get 9. Between 7,000 and 7,999, I get 8. Between 8,000 and 8,999, I get 7. Between 9,000 and 9,999, I have 1. And then I have 1 for my last category as well. So now I've created a frequency histogram. Next up, I want to create a relative frequency histogram for the same chart. So I'm doing the same thing, it's just now I'm coming up with percentages instead of frequencies. So I'm going to create the same groupings at the bottom. Now this time on the side, my highest frequency that I had was 20. Well, as this was out of 50 total points, so 20 out of 50 would be 40%. So my highest percent is going to be 40%. Okay, so now I have my percentages labeled. I'm just going to convert those frequencies that I had before this into percentages. So 4 out of 50, that's 8%. 20 out of 50 is 40%. 9 out of 50, that gives me 18%. 8 out of 50, that's 16%. 7 out of 50 is 14%. And then 1 out of 50, that's 2%, and 2% for my last one as well. So you'll notice that my chart looks exactly the same. The only difference is that my y-axis is different in each of the charts. In one it's measuring a percent, and in the other it's measuring a frequency. So much of the time the shape of a histogram has a tail which extends farther to the right or left from its center. This means that the graph is skewed to the right or the left. Looking at our graph, is our graph skewed to the right or to the left? Well, if I look at this, this is kind of like my center, and my tail is coming out this way. So my tail is coming out to the right, meaning that my graph is skewed to the right. And that's everything for section 5.